We back with another reflection on the daily Vedantic. And this one is going to be pretty far out there. I've never heard anyone talk about this subject of environment influencing language, East versus West. And in many ways, this is an oversimplification because it's going to be a 5 to 10 minute reflection on environments that shaped languages, and then those languages, how those shaped cultures and perspectives on the world, how language shapes worldview. So it's going to be simplistic in many ways because it's going to be a short daily reflection. But this topic is one that I've thought about for months now, ever since first discovering that the Arabic language leads to different thought patterns than a language like English, and how it affects thought, and how one language can still be usable after a patient can get a stroke if they speak Arabic, and how it can't and doesn't translate if someone gets a stroke in that same area of the brain in English, and it breaks up that language. It is a fascinating topic to think about how language and the brain work together, and how different languages create different patterns within our brain. So once I had discovered that or heard that, I literally was scrolling through YouTube and someone had a interesting story about that. And I remember looking it up later and finding out the intricacies of this. This was maybe 8 months ago. And I was like, wow, we take that for granted so often, that language is just, we think it's the same across all cultures. And then I started to think about the differences between Greek and Sanskrit, the root languages of East and West. The Gospels were written in Greek because it was the universal language within the Roman Empire at the time. Sanskrit is the root language of, and it's still the language of, all of the seminal texts within Vedanta, within the Vedas, the 4 oldest philosophical textbooks on the planet. And then I started to think about the environments in which those languages were developed. We conventionally think about India as poor, as a developing nation. But in the 19th century, in the 1800s, India was on par with England, was on par with America, was on par with really everywhere around the world. It was just abject poverty everywhere. The life expectancy in 10,000 BC, when we were living in caves, was about 30. The life expectancy in the year 1840, anywhere around the world, was 35. We're basically, health-wise, prosperity-wise, not that much better than our cave-dwelling ancestors in the 19th century, in the 1800s. Profound, and we think that Europe has always been materially wealthy, and it hasn't been. The actual historical truth is India, with its fertile ground, its rivers, and lush jungles, was always wealthier than the West. It's until the 18th and 19th century. As the adage goes, all of Rome's gold was spent in India for its spices, to import spices from India. Now that's historically also an oversimplification, but a lot of Rome's gold was spent on spices from India. America itself was discovered because Christopher Columbus was looking for a route to India. He wasn't looking for a route to India because of India's gold. He was looking for a simpler route to India to improve the trade and importation of its spices. It's crazy how the tongue make you spend all your gold. Even back then, and for a lot of people, still to this day. But that fertile ground in India supported up to 8,000 different kingdoms at one time, peacefully. That's the craziest part. Peacefully. Outside of Islamic influence, India, in its Hindu background, and before that, its Vedic tradition, and the Vedic background, extremely peaceful. for that many people, for that many kingdoms to all live shoulder to shoulder peacefully. Remarkable. And it's not just because it's a high-minded society. It's really just because there was so much abundance. It was not a land of scarcity. There was so much abundance, they didn't need to fight with each other. The European climb through the Industrial Revolution comes along in the 19th century, shoots way past everywhere else. The technological development of weapons, of better ships, all of these things take place in the last 200, 250 years. And then you have the education system in the West that really only had exposure to Western thinkers, Western traditions, very little educational exposure to what was being taught in the East. In fact, we only got the Bhagavad Gita, the canonical text of the Vedanta. We only got that in the late 1700s, so we've only had that for about 230 years. So, India was kind of left out of the historical texts that went back to the Roman Empire, describing the Roman Empire and the Greek different kingdoms before that as the source of the European story, and gets convoluted as the source of the global story. And it's true. You can find the lineage from the British Empire to the Roman Empire to the Greek kingdoms. But even Alexander the Great, he was working his way east because of the profound wealth that every Greek citizen knew existed in India. And he was working his way east, not just for the attraction towards India's wealth, but because Greek was an arid land of scarcity. That's why there was so much conflict between the Greek kingdoms. In fact, when you compare the kingdoms that were shoulder to shoulder in Greece to the kingdom shoulder to shoulder in India, you have constant conflict and war versus relative peace for thousands of years in India. So I asked ChatGPT about this, about how the environment may have shaped the language, and how the languages that these different parts of the world come from, how the languages then shape our worldviews. Here is the question. Did the environment around Greece shape the development of its language? Compare and contrast its development versus the language of Sanskrit in the environment of India as it was developed. And Sanskrit really predates India. India is a name that was kind of projected onto that area of the world by outsiders, like we as humans tend to do. But here is the answer, and I asked it for an 8-sentence summary of the answer so I could read it much more easily than the first answer I had. It was probably 15 to 20 sentences long. Languages often carry the imprint of the landscapes in which they emerge. In the West, exemplified by Greek, language evolved in relatively arid, scarce environments, where survival demanded clear distinctions and competitive debate. This scarcity pressed speech toward an analytic mode, breaking concepts apart, defining boundaries, and sharpening categories. Greek's grammar and philosophy mirrors this impulse, emphasizing logic, law, and the separation of being from non-being. Analytic means separation of things. In the East, exemplified by Sanskrit, language developed in fertile, abundant river valleys, such as India, where surplus allowed reflection, ritual, and metaphysical speculation. This abundance pressed speech toward a synthetic mode, weaving, synthesis being the root of that word, bringing things together. Weaving meanings together, allowing words to carry multiple layers, and embracing paradox rather than eliminating it. Sanskrit's root-based system and its use in Vedic ritual reveal a language that integrates rather than divides, combining outer and inner worlds in a single term. Good example of that, this is me speaking. A good example of that would be the term dharma, which means you could take up 2 pages describing what that word means in English, depending on the context. Thus, while Greek exemplifies an analytic language that dissects reality, Sanskrit exemplifies a synthetic language that unifies it. each reflecting the ecological and cultural ground from which it sprang. What an interesting contrast in the well springs of Eastern and Western language, where you have one that's analytical. It is used as a tool linguistically to separate things, to categorize things. It's used for debate. It's used where every little ounce needs to be accounted for because of, as it notes, a ecological condition of scarcity, versus the fertility in a place like the subcontinent of Asia, where we call India, where you have synthetic tendencies, where you have time, the privilege of reflection, because you have a lot of your base needs already met. You have the stability, instead of worrying about war at all times, you have the stability of peace to reflect within, to go within. I think this is why the modern world we live in, we're seeing this huge rediscovery of Eastern wisdoms, because we have time. And the differences in the well springs of these languages in different parts of the world, environments which they came from, is really interesting to reflect on. Because one, the analytic language cultivates a mind that linguistically dissects reality into parts, while the synthetic approach cultivates a perspective of finding connections, not looking for delineations. Again, as I said at the beginning of this episode, in many ways this can be an oversimplification. Certainly there are many individuals that are phenomenal at finding connections in the West, and there are individuals that are phenomenal at analyzing and finding delineations in the East. But it is an interesting area to explore how an environment shapes a language and how language shapes our worldview, our culture, our perspectives, collectively, individually, because there is undoubtedly an influence. Where it begins and ends in us as individuals, well, that is individual. But this connection doesn't take but a few seconds on ChatGPT or Grok or Gemini, whatever AI platform you want to look up. Doesn't take but a few seconds, a few prompts, to see that it is a well understood connection between language and worldview. But what I had not really looked into is how our root languages in the West differ from the root languages of the East, in the example of Greek and Sanskrit. It is fascinating to see how our environments can shape us, even on such a fundamental level, such as language, each having its pros and cons to it. It's almost as if if you are in the West watching this, or you grew up learning English, it is a great foundation to see the distinctions between things. It's almost like they form the full arc of human cognition: separation to understand and connection to transcend. Language, culture, and the effects they have on our worldview. That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. If you haven't hit that like or subscribe, and you dig these daily reflections, tap them buttons. It'll help others explore and come across these videos as well. We'll see you next time.